So clearly these constant load tests, those two are the best examples of constant load tests, are not fit for purpose because they don't have anything physiological to refer to. So we'll look at lactate-based tests, and hopefully straight away you'll go, oh God, in the green paper they refer to the fact, when they're talking about definitions or writing about definitions, that anything which is kind of lactate-based is not accounting for high-energy phosphates, ATP, PC, or adenylate kinase, which is absolutely spot on. So I just want to show you these tests, again, very quickly, to kind of give you a sense of why lactate in itself and lactate-based tests do not identify the anaerobic capacity. So Fischer-Stacker proposed what in essence a peak blood lactate test, which in itself is very controversial. So their argument is that lactate concentrations mirrors the pH status of the muscle. So their argument is the greater the anaerobic component, the higher the blood lactate score. And their argument is that if lactate goes up, there must be a greater anaerobic contribution. Now, to a degree, that makes a reasonable amount of sense, doesn't it? That it refers to glycolysis, and it makes a lot of sense. But there are other reasons why lactate would go up, and is lactate really just a proxy indicator of anaerobic capacity? Because you don't produce lactate, I'll rephrase that, you produce very little lactate in response to energy that is predominantly fueled through the high energy phosphates. So it doesn't reflect all of the energy pathways that are at play. And so what they were suggesting was you measure a peak lactate value in recovery, and it's 1 minute of all-out exercise, and the higher the score, the greater the anaerobic capacity. Well, the problem with that is that, it doesn't take into account what's happening in that 1 minute bout of exercise. That you could have an athlete who is highly aerobic, like a Michael Phelps, right? Everybody knows about Phelps, great swimmer. Highly aerobic, but had a large anaerobic capacity. He needed a large anaerobic capacity for the events like the 100 and 200 that he would swim. But he was still aerobically based. But his highest peak lactate score was never higher than about 4.5 millimoles. So you'd compare him to somebody that's got 10 millimoles, and you would go, well, the person with 10 millimoles has got a higher anaerobic capacity, because this test says the higher the lactate score, the higher the anaerobic capacity. But the reason people have high lactate scores is because aerobic metabolism is not meeting the demands. It's not about the size of the capacity itself. So you can kind of see what's going on in here. You can see 3 iterations of the test in the left panel. And what they've done is they've in essence measured the blood lactate in minutes after the test. They've actually done it for 70 minutes. And then they take the highest lactate score, and the highest is their proxy indicator of capacity. But you can see why this doesn't really seem to be fit for purpose in terms of, it is discarding all the notions of, one, it's a time limited test, it's 1 minute. Is that long enough to wring out the capacity? And 2, it's discarding anything which is really to do with high energy phosphates. And again, we haven't separated the aerobic contribution from the anaerobic contribution. But they do write this, which is these results suggest that a higher ability of lactate acid formation might be one contributing factor to anaerobic performance capacity, and the peak blood lactate concentration at 7.65 minutes may be one of the valid indicators of anaerobic work capacity in man. Number of things going on. They even concede it's one factor. Secondly, it's lactate, not lactic acid. Lactic acid isn't really anything at all. It's kind of a made-up term. And where does 7.65 mins come from? It's kind of like an odd thing. You can't make that assumption that it's the same for every individual. So we'll just very quickly look at this test from Numella, and then we can get on to the kind of the close to gold standard. So Numella proposes what's called the maximal anaerobic running test. So in this example, it's a discontinuous protocol, 20-second runs, and you start at VO2 max, and each progressive run gets higher and higher until we end up at 200% VO2 max. So each run has 100 seconds recovery, and they increase quite slowly by about 1.4 kilometers per hour. And what you do is you then take a lactate concentration after each sprint. And what they do is they then suggest, well, you take two concentrations, which is 5 millimoles per litre and 10 millimoles per litre, and they refer to this as what they call sprinting economy. And sprinting economy is in essence their kind of euphemistic term for anaerobic capacity. So this is really interesting. 5 millimole and 10 millimole. So in the previous test, Fujitaka is saying you take the highest lactate concentration as anaerobic capacity. In this one, they're saying, no, you take two fixed lactate concentrations. But think about that very logically. Although you're finding the speed at a lactate concentration, 5 millimole, Phelps would never get to it, and yet we know Phelps has got a large anaerobic capacity, he peaks out at about 4. But why is it 5 and 10? Where have those concentrations come from? Does having a lactate concentration of 5 millimoles really indicate that there's a contribution, large enough contribution with the anaerobic capacity? Why is it 5 and 10? Is it because 10 millimole is associated, with what happens at the end of most tests, VO2 max tests, in a lot of participants? There doesn't seem to be any kind of rationale for this. So this is kind of what it would look like. Don't worry about doing the counter movement jumps in the recovery phase, but you can kind of see the way the protocol is designed. And then this is what the data would look like. So in the left panel, you can see the running speed increasing during the test, and then you can see the lactate concentration rising, and then they've got the lactate in recovery. In the right panel, what they've measured is the oxygen uptake throughout the same test. And from this, they're then able to extrapolate the 5 millimole. So if we look at the panel on the left, we would come into the data set and we would go 5 millimole is probably around about here, and then we would go up to 10 millimole, which is about here, and they would then say that this zone, that range of speeds represents the anaerobic capacity zone. Doesn't make much sense though, does it? Because clearly they're working at workloads in excess of 10 millimoles. So where's that energy coming from? So there's an awful misconception within a lot of these kind of tests in terms of what the physiology is about. And the final example to really show you how bad physiological understanding can be is the sprint running test by Helvig. So in this example, again, it's lactate-based 3x60 meter sprints. And what you do is you ask the participant to run 60 meters, and then what they do is they run each 60 meters then are run half a second slower. So you run flat out, and then you're asked to run half a second slower for the next one and half a second slower for the subsequent one. And what they're getting at in this one is, well, rather than having overall anaerobic capacity, they're trying to isolate the alactic capacity. So in other words, the capacity of energy that comes from the high energy phosphates. And they argue, well, it's a concentration of 6 millimole per litre. Well, let's think about that very logically. If you're using the high energy phosphates, ATP-PC, there is almost no lactate cost. There is some, but there's very little. 6 millimoles implies a large anaerobic substrate metabolism contribution from glycolysis. 6. So why is it 6 millimole? And that clearly doesn't seem to have any bearing on the total amount of energy that could come from the high energy phosphates. So again, a misconception for a test in terms of the basic physiology. You have to understand the physiology before you can pick the right test. And clearly, we don't produce vast amounts of lactate using high energy phosphates, ATP-PC adenylate kinase. And so what you end up with is this kind of response. Now I'm going to show you this test. So this is on a sprint treadmill from our lab. So what we've got here is, well, actually it's Phoebe. So she's running for 60 meters. So we did it on a sprint treadmill, you could do it on the track. And at the end of the test, Alicia, who's in the background, is going to take a lactate concentration from her. So that's 60 meters. We get the lactate concentration, and then amazingly, you've got to run after a break half a second slower. Think about how difficult that is to run half a second slower. But what you can see here is 3 different groups, and you can see the 6 millimole line. So what they're saying is that the for the blue line, you've got a speed of, well, what would we call that? That's probably about 7.3 meters per second. So that's, they're arguing, is the anaerobic capacity from alactic sources. How a single speed can be that makes no sense either. Think about that very logically. How could that be? How could that be the case? How can a single speed have that as the case? It doesn't make much sense. If we then go to our red trace, in the red trace here, it's about 7.3, maybe a little bit more, maybe 7.5, and then in the green line here, it's about 7.7. So how can there's so much wrong with this as a test that it doesn't make any logical sense. But the reason I wanted to show you them was so you can understand why we have to get our basic physiology right before we can actually have a test that is fit for purpose.